Every flag has a story, but few are written in such struggle, sacrifice, and defiance as the story of America. Behind the shining symbol of freedom lies a nation built not just by heroes but by people who bled, toiled, and endured the impossible. The land of the brave was never born in comfort. It was carved from chaos, from revolution and rebellion, from slavery and civil war, from the whispers of injustice and the roars of those who refuse to be silenced. This is not the America of textbooks or speeches. This is the untold America, a story of contradiction and courage, of progress paid for in pain, and of people who believed that freedom was worth everything, because bravery isn't about winning. It's about standing, even when the world says you can't. Before America became an idea, it was a rebellion. Long before the Declaration of Independence was inked on parchment, long before the cannon fire echoed across harbors and forests, a spark had ignited in the hearts of ordinary men and women. It was not a spark of fortune or ambition, nor of royal entitlement, but a spark of conviction. The raw, unyielding belief that freedom was worth any cost. Farmers who had never held a sword in anger, blacksmiths whose strongest weapon was a hammer, and dreamers who dared to imagine a life beyond the crown of a distant king, found themselves drawn into a struggle they neither chose nor could have predicted. Yet history does not favor the cautious. It is written by those who act, who risk, who bleed for what they believe in. Life under British rule had become a quiet, creeping oppression. Taxes were levied on tea, on paper, on every simple act of trade, while representation in government was denied. The colonies were chained, not with iron but with rules and decrees, with a law that whispered to the people that they were subjects, not citizens. And yet beneath the daily grind of life, tending fields, forging tools, raising children, there was a simmering sense that something was fundamentally wrong. The colonists were not content to live as obedient shadows of a distant empire. They yearned for voice, for agency, for a chance to shape their own destiny. That yearning, fragile yet fierce, became the undercurrent of revolution. The first acts of defiance were small, almost imperceptible. A group of merchants refusing to unload taxed goods, Sons of Liberty meeting in darkened taverns, their whispers of liberty echoing against the walls. The Boston Tea Party was more than an act of protest. It was a statement to the world that the people were no longer willing to submit. When the tea crates plunged into the harbor, it was not just tea that sank beneath the waves. It was the illusion of unquestioned authority. And with each passing act, the resolve of ordinary men hardened into something formidable. The air itself seemed charged with possibility. The colonies were awakening, yet rebellion is never neat. It is messy, chaotic, and frightening. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, the world seemed to hold its breath. Minutemen, ordinary citizens armed with little more than muskets and courage, faced trained soldiers of the mightiest empire on earth. There was no grand strategy, no promise of victory, only the stubborn determination that they could not, would not bow. And in those moments, the war became more than a conflict over taxes or trade. It became a war for the right to think freely, to govern one's own life, to assert the inalienable dignity of human existence. Each musket blast, each fallen friend was a testament to the human desire to be free. The winter of 1777 at Valley Forge was a crucible. Hunger gnawed at the stomachs of soldiers. Frostbitten feet and aching limbs made each day a battle for survival. Yet even in suffering there was resilience. Officers drilled men who had never seen discipline, shaping ragged militias into forces capable of facing a professional army. George Washington, weary but unwavering, embodied the spirit of sacrifice. Leadership was not simply about strategy. It was about instilling belief. He did not just command. He inspired. Soldiers learned to endure, to trust, and to fight not for gold, but for a vision of a nation yet unborn. Each frost-covered night was a lesson in perseverance, a reminder that freedom demands more than desire. It demands endurance. Across the seas, the British saw rebellion as an inconvenience, a minor uprising that could be crushed by superior force. They underestimated not just the fighting spirit of the colonists, but their ingenuity. Guerrilla tactics, swift ambushes, and intimate knowledge of the land became weapons as effective as cannons. Farmers turned soldiers, knew every hill, every forest path, every river crossing. Their lives depended on mastery of their environment, and they wielded that knowledge with lethal precision. Battles were won not solely by numbers, but by heart, by strategy born of desperation and determination. Freedom was becoming a tangible, though costly, reality. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776, was more than a political document. It was a declaration of human will, a manifesto of belief in the fundamental rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was written not on the safe grounds of comfort, but against the backdrop of war, hunger, and uncertainty. Each word carried the weight of risk, for to declare independence was to declare war. To sign was to risk property, liberty, and life itself. And yet those words, painstakingly crafted and courageously signed, illuminated a truth that resonated across generations. Freedom is not given. It is claimed. It is seized. It is defended with every fiber of one's being. Women, too, played a role often overlooked. They maintained farms, cared for the wounded, and kept the fires of resistance burning at home. Abigail Adams wrote letters that challenged the very notion of authority, reminding leaders that the fight for liberty must include all people. Enslaved Africans escaped chains in pursuit of freedom, some joining the British in hope, others fighting alongside patriots, each action a bold assertion of human dignity. The struggle for independence was a collective effort, uniting people across lines of gender, class, and race, each contributing to a force that was unstoppable in its conviction. As battles raged from the northern forests of New York to the southern plantations of Georgia, the war tested every assumption about strength and courage. Victories were often hard-won, defeats bitterly endured. The Siege of Yorktown, a culminating moment of strategy and endurance, demonstrated that resolve combined with cooperation could overcome even the most formidable opponents. French allies brought supplies, troops, and naval power, recognizing that the fight for freedom in the colonies was a fight for principle itself. The war was no longer just local. It had become global in consequence, its outcome shaping the ideals of nations yet to come. The post-war reality was sobering. Victory did not erase suffering, nor did it immediately guarantee equality or prosperity. Homes had been destroyed, economies shattered, families separated, yet even in the rubble there was triumph. The colonies had achieved what many believed impossible. They had created a nation grounded not in the whims of kings, but in the consent of the governed. The American experiment had begun. The Constitution and Bill of Rights would follow. But the true foundation had already been laid. A foundation of courage, resilience, and unyielding belief in human potential. Independence was not a single event. It was a continuum of sacrifice and determination, an ongoing promise that liberty requires vigilance, courage, and heart. Even today, the echoes of that rebellion resonate. The fight for independence reminds us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. That courage is not the absence of fear but the mastery of it. That freedom is not inherited but fought for every generation anew. The stories of farmers turned soldiers, of women who defied convention, of leaders who risked everything for a vision, teach us that true liberty demands participation, endurance, and unshakable belief. The revolution was more than a war. It was a testament to the human spirit, to the enduring desire to claim one's destiny, and to the unbreakable idea that some things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are worth every sacrifice. As the sun set over battlefields and quiet farms alike, the men and women who had dared to dream of independence left a legacy that continues to inspire. They taught us that freedom is not a gift, but a responsibility, that bravery is forged in the crucible of challenge, that the path to liberty is never easy but always necessary, and that the fight for independence, though centuries past, is not merely history. It is a living call, reminding us that the pursuit of justice, the courage to act, and the will to endure remain the essence of what it means to be free. Before America became an idea, it was a rebellion. Long before the Declaration of Independence was inked on parchment, before the muskets roared and cannon smoke clouded the air, a quiet determination simmered in the hearts of ordinary men and women. It was not a spark born from wealth or status, nor from privilege or power. It was a spark born from conviction, the raw, unyielding belief that freedom was worth any cost. Farmers who had never held a sword in anger, blacksmiths whose strongest weapon was a hammer, teachers who could barely read a map, and dreamers who dared to imagine a life beyond the crown of a distant king, all found themselves drawn into a struggle neither chosen nor desired. Yet history does not favor the cautious. It is written by those who act, who risk, who bleed for what they believe in. Life under British rule had become a creeping oppression. Taxes levied on paper, on tea, on every simple transaction seemed minor at first, but they carried a weight far heavier than coins. The colonists were told they had no voice in government, no representation, no say in laws that bound them. A distant king decided the fate of lives he would never meet, and magistrates enforced rules that seemed arbitrary, unfair, and cruel. The colonies were chained not with iron, but with the invisible bonds of authority, with laws that whispered to the people that they were subjects, not citizens. And yet, beneath the daily grind of labor, tending fields, forging tools, raising families, there was a simmering sense of injustice. Ordinary men and women began to ask, if life, liberty, and property are rights, why do we live as slaves to a distant throne? That yearning, fragile yet fierce, became the undercurrent of revolution. At first, defiance was subtle, almost invisible. Groups of merchants refused to unload taxed goods. Sons of liberty met in shadowed taverns, whispering plans that could cost them their lives. The Boston Tea Party was not simply an act of protest, but a declaration. The people were no longer willing to accept oppression in silence. When crates of tea plunged into the harbor, it was not merely tea that sank beneath the waves. It was the illusion of unquestioned authority, and with each act of courage, ordinary men hardened into something formidable. Farmers, tradesmen, and clerks were becoming soldiers. Mothers, sisters, and wives were becoming the backbone of resistance. The air itself seemed charged with possibility. The colonies were awakening. But rebellion is messy. It is chaotic, unpredictable, and terrifying. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, the world seemed to pause. Minutemen, armed with little more than rifles, faced trained soldiers of the mightiest empire on earth. The colonists were inexperienced, undersupplied, and often poorly armed. Yet their resolve was unstoppable. They understood that they were not merely fighting for territory or economic rights, but for the right to think freely, to govern their own lives, to claim the dignity of self-determination. Every musket shot, every falling comrade, was a testament to human courage in the face of impossible odds. The winter of 1777 at Valley Forge was a crucible of endurance. Frostbitten feet, aching limbs, and hunger gnawed at the men who had volunteered to fight. Their uniforms were tattered, their boots were holes in the snow. Supplies were scarce, morale was fragile. Yet, in the cold, the soldiers found purpose. Officers drilled men who had never before seen the precision of military tactics, transforming ragged militias into disciplined forces capable of standing against a professional army. George Washington, ever resolute, moved among his troops, inspiring belief in a vision greater than themselves. Leadership was not just strategy, it was hope. It was courage passed from one human heart to another. Each frozen night at Valley Forge was a lesson in perseverance, a reminder that freedom demands not just desire but endurance. Across the Atlantic, the British believed they were fighting a minor insurrection that would soon collapse. They underestimated not just the fighting spirit of the colonists, but their ingenuity. Guerrilla tactics, surprise ambushes, and intimate knowledge of the land became weapons as powerful as cannons. Farmers turned soldiers knew every hill, every forest path, every river crossing. Their lives depended on this mastery, and they wielded it with lethal precision. Battles were not won by numbers alone, but by determination, strategy, and intimate knowledge of the land. Freedom was becoming tangible, yet it remained fragile, a dream threatened at every turn. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776, was more than a legal document. It was a manifesto of human will, a statement that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not privileges granted by kings, but inalienable rights of all people. It was written against a backdrop of uncertainty, of cannon fire and hunger, of a war that had already claimed thousands of lives. To sign it was to risk property, liberty, and life. And yet, the signers did so, not for fame or fortune, but because they believed in something greater than themselves. Those words illuminated a truth that resonates to this day. Freedom is not given. It is claimed, seized, defended with every fiber of being. Women played roles often overlooked. They maintained farms, cared for the wounded, and kept communities alive while husbands and sons were on the battlefield. Abigail Adams wrote letters urging inclusion in the fight for liberty, reminding leaders that the promise of freedom should extend to all. Enslaved Africans sought freedom wherever possible, some fleeing to join the British, others fighting alongside. Patriots, each action a bold assertion of human dignity. The struggle for independence united people across lines of gender, class, and race, each contribution an essential thread in the tapestry of revolution. Battles raged from the forests of New York to the plantations of Georgia. The war tested every assumption about strength, courage, and resilience. Victories were hard won, defeats bitter. The siege of Yorktown became the defining moment where coordination, perseverance, and international alliances culminated in victory. French troops and naval forces provided supplies, soldiers, and strategic advantage. Recognizing that the American fight was a fight for principle, the war had become global in consequence, its outcome shaping the ideals of nations yet to rise. Victory did not erase suffering. Homes had been destroyed, economies shattered, families displaced. Soldiers returned with scars, both visible and invisible. Slavery remained in some states. Native American tribes were further displaced. Yet even in the aftermath of destruction, the colonies had achieved what many believed impossible. A nation founded not on the whims of kings, but on the consent of the governed. The American experiment had begun, grounded in courage, resilience, and unyielding belief in human potential. Independence was not a single event. It was a continuum of sacrifice, struggle, and determination. The lessons of this struggle echo today. Ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary feats. Courage is not the absence of fear, but mastery over it. Freedom is not inherited, it is fought for, generation after generation. The stories of farmers turned soldiers, of women who defied societal norms, of leaders who risked all for a vision, remind us that liberty requires participation, endurance, and unwavering conviction. The revolution was more than a war. It was a testament to the human spirit, to the enduring desire to claim one's destiny, and to the unbreakable idea that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are worth every sacrifice. The sun set over battlefields and quiet farms alike, leaving behind a landscape of devastation and hope intertwined. Those who had dared to dream of independence left a legacy that continues to inspire. They taught that freedom is a responsibility, that bravery is forged in the crucible of challenge, and that the pursuit of liberty is never complete. The fight for independence, though centuries past, is not simply history. It is a living call to act, to endure, and to uphold the ideals for which so many risked everything. Every generation must answer that call anew, for liberty is not a destination, but a journey sustained by courage, sacrifice, and unwavering belief in the worth of freedom itself. While freedom rang from the lips of patriots, millions were chained in silence. As the new nation was being forged in the fires of revolution, another battle raged in the shadows. A battle for life itself, for dignity, for the basic human right to exist unshackled. The contradiction between liberty and bondage tore at the soul of a nation still finding its identity. Across sprawling plantations in the South, along hidden paths of the Underground Railroad, and within the whispered prayers of enslaved families, courage manifested in ways often unseen, unheard yet profoundly powerful. Here bravery was not defined by muskets or cannons, but by the simple yet revolutionary act of holding on to hope. From the earliest days of colonial America, slavery was embedded in the economy, culture, and society. Africans were captured, torn from their homes, and transported across the Atlantic in conditions so horrific that death was commonplace. Those who survived endured a life of relentless labor, brutality, and dehumanization. They tilled fields from dawn to dusk, built homes in towns they would never own, and raised children under the constant shadow of cruelty. Yet even in the most oppressive circumstances, they nurtured dreams of freedom. These dreams, whispered in song, hidden in coded messages and carried in secret gatherings, became acts of resistance. The human spirit refused to be extinguished. Families were often separated, ripped apart by auctions and forced sales, each parent and child left with a fragment of what it meant to belong. Despite this, enslaved people preserved their culture, their stories, their faith, and their determination. Spirituals were not merely songs. They were maps, warnings, messages, and declarations of hope. Lyrics like "Follow the Drinking Gourd" guided people northward to safety, encoded in melodies that seemed ordinary but carried the weight of liberation. Every whispered plan, every hidden letter, every escape attempt was an act of defiance that required more courage than most could imagine. To dream of freedom in chains was rebellion in its purest form. The daily life of the enslaved was a testament to endurance. Men, women, and children labored in the fields, harvesting crops under the sun's relentless glare, often beaten for the smallest misstep. Yet in moments of quiet they found strength. Stories of ancestors, oral histories passed down through generations, gave purpose and a sense of identity that could not be stolen. Even in captivity, they preserved humanity. They resisted subtly, refusing to work efficiently, maintaining their language and customs, teaching children despite forbidding circumstances. Every small act of self-preservation was a silent protest against a system designed to erase them. Across the southern states, enslavers wielded immense power, justifying cruelty with laws, religion, and social norms. Yet paradoxically, the very existence of slavery created the conditions for extraordinary bravery. It forced people to act with ingenuity, courage, and resilience. Escape, for instance, was a perilous endeavor. The Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses, required trust, secrecy, and unwavering determination. Those who guided fugitives risked death or imprisonment. Those who fled faced unimaginable danger. Patrols, bloodhounds, unfamiliar terrain, hunger, and the constant threat of recapture. Every journey northward was a testament to human perseverance, a gamble between life in chains and the perilous promise of freedom. Some of the most inspiring stories came from those who escaped and returned to guide others. Harriet Tubman, known as the Moses of her people, risked everything repeatedly. Her courage was not measured in a single act but in a lifetime of commitment. She led dozens to freedom, navigating forests, rivers, and swamps, always attentive to the dangers around her. Each successful escape was not just liberation for the individual, but a blow to the institution that sought to dehumanize them. Her story, and those of countless others, illuminated the moral bankruptcy of slavery while celebrating the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit. Resistance also took subtler, daily forms. Work slowdowns, deliberate mistakes, and the maintenance of cultural practices became quiet, yet powerful defiance. Religion provided both solace and strategy. Enslaved preachers wove messages of hope into sermons. Their congregations listened not only to the spiritual guidance but also to coded messages about escape or survival. Education, too, became an act of rebellion. Teaching children to read and write was forbidden, yet some parents risked their lives to ensure the next generation could wield literacy as a tool of empowerment. The Civil War, decades later, revealed the depth of this courage. Millions of enslaved people endured unimaginable conditions, yet their desire for freedom became a force that reshaped the nation. Some fled to Union lines, serving as guides, laborers, and soldiers, contributing to the war effort that would eventually lead to emancipation. They understood that liberty was not merely a personal goal, but a collective necessity. Every step toward freedom challenged not only the system of slavery but the moral conscience of a nation claiming to value liberty for all. Despite the eventual abolition of slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, the struggle for equality did not end. Freed people faced violent reprisals, discriminatory laws, and systemic barriers. Yet even in these conditions they persevered, built communities, established schools, and laid the foundations for future generations to claim the rights that had long been denied. The bravery displayed in the plantations, in the secret paths of the Underground Railroad, and in the hearts of enslaved individuals became the blueprint for courage in the face of injustice that continues to inspire movements for equality today. The moral contradiction between the ideals of the American Revolution and the reality of slavery haunted the new nation. Leaders who celebrated freedom often owned human beings. Documents proclaiming universal rights coexisted with chains and whips. This tension shaped political debates, fueled abolitionist movements, and created the conditions for one of America's most defining conflicts. It was in this context that the truest form of bravery emerged. The courage to assert humanity in the face of systemic denial, to fight for freedom even when the world seemed designed to suppress it. Stories of bravery were not limited to the leaders often remembered in history books. They were in the hands calloused from labor, in the songs sung softly under the stars, in the children who learned to read in secret, and in the mothers and fathers who preserved their families against impossible odds. Each act of courage, each silent rebellion, each escape attempt, contributed to the slow but unstoppable march toward liberty. As the nation grew, the legacy of slavery left indelible marks caught in law, culture, and memory. Yet it also produced stories of resistance, hope, and triumph that endure. Monuments cannot capture the courage of those who endured decades of bondage, but the memory of their struggle shapes every understanding of freedom. The shadow of slavery reminds us that liberty, when measured against oppression, is always fragile, and that true courage often occurs far from the spotlight, in quiet acts of defiance, in the unbroken will to survive, and in the unwavering hope for a better tomorrow. Even today, the echoes of their struggle resonate. They remind us that freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of opportunity, dignity, and recognition. They teach us that bravery is not only battlefield heroism, but the courage to exist fully in the face of oppression, to dream when dreams are forbidden, and to claim humanity when the world denies it. The shadow of slavery, dark and painful as it was, illuminated the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. From plantations to hidden paths, from whispered prayers to daring escapes, from silent endurance to active rebellion, the story of enslaved people is a story of relentless courage. It is a story that challenges us to recognize the complexities of freedom, the price of liberty, and the ongoing struggle for justice. The American narrative is incomplete without it, for it was within this shadow that the light of true bravery first burned, a light that continues to guide every generation seeking equality, dignity, and freedom. The shadow of slavery is long, but within it hope endured. Those who were enslaved created legacies of courage that outlived chains and whips, that outlasted oppression and fear. They taught that liberty is not granted but seized, that dignity is not given but preserved, that hope is not passive but active, a force that can reshape lives and nations. The courage of the enslaved became a cornerstone of America's moral evolution, reminding us that freedom is never fully realized unless it is extended to all. Even as the nation celebrated independence, the enslaved stood as a living testament to a truth the founders could not fully embrace. Freedom is meaningless if it is not universal, and in their endurance, ingenuity, and hope, the enslaved wrote a history that is as essential to understanding America as the battles, declarations, and founding fathers often commemorated. In the secret fields, hidden paths, and whispered prayers, the essence of bravery was defined not by swords or proclamations, but by the unyielding spirit that refused to be broken. It was a courage born of necessity, sharpened by oppression and sustained by hope. It was the courage to dream of freedom even when born in captivity, and it is a courage that echoes still, reminding us that liberty, justice, and equality are ongoing struggles that demand bravery, perseverance, and unwavering hope. While freedom rang from the lips of patriots, millions were chained in silence. As the new nation was being forged in the fires of revolution, another quieter battle raged. A battle for life, for dignity, for the simple human right to exist unshackled. The contradiction between liberty and bondage tore at the soul of a nation that claimed freedom for some, but denied it to others. Across sprawling plantations in the South, along the secret paths of the Underground Railroad, in the whispered prayers of families torn apart, courage manifested in ways often unseen, yet profoundly powerful. Here bravery was not measured in muskets or cannon fire, but in the audacious act of dreaming of freedom when every circumstance told you it was impossible. From the earliest days of colonial America, slavery was embedded in the economy, culture, and social structure. Africans were captured in distant lands, torn from their homes, and transported across the Atlantic in conditions so brutal that many did not survive the journey. Those who did endured lives of relentless labor, abuse, and dehumanization. They tilled fields under the scorching sun, constructed homes and buildings they would never own, and raised children under the constant threat of violence. And yet, even in the most oppressive circumstances, hope endured. Stories passed down from one generation to the next, songs sung in secret, prayers whispered in the dark, all became acts of resistance. Families were often torn apart by sales and auctions, leaving children with fragments of parents, parents with fragments of children. In this separation, enslaved people found ways to preserve identity and dignity. Spirituals were more than songs. They were messages of survival, hope, and resistance. Lyrics such as "Follow the Drinking Gourd" contained directions to the north, guiding escapees toward freedom. These melodies, seemingly innocent, carried the weight of liberation. Every whispered plan, every hidden letter, every risked step toward freedom was an act of defiance demanding immeasurable courage. The daily life of enslaved people was an endurance test. Men, women, and children labored from dawn to dusk, punished severely for the smallest errors. Yet even in this harshness they found ways to resist, maintaining cultural practices, teaching children in secret, preserving their language and faith. All were forms of rebellion. Every small act of self-preservation became a silent protest against a system designed to erase them. Even survival itself was an assertion of defiance, a quiet but profound bravery. Southern plantations were sites of immense cruelty, justified by laws, social norms, and misappropriated religion. Owners wielded unchecked power, yet this oppression produced extraordinary courage. Escape, the ultimate act of defiance, was perilous. The Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses, demanded secrecy, trust, and nerve. Those who guided fugitives risked imprisonment or death. Those who fled faced dangers from patrols, bloodhounds, starvation, and treacherous terrain. Each successful escape was not only liberation for the individual, but a blow to an institution built on dehumanization. Harriet Tubman, the legendary Moses of her people, exemplified this courage. Born into slavery in Maryland, she escaped and returned repeatedly to guide dozens to freedom. She navigated forests, rivers, and swamps with unwavering determination, always aware of the lethal risks. Her actions illuminated the human capacity for courage, ingenuity, and moral conviction. Others, though less famous, performed similar acts of heroism. Mothers and fathers risking their lives to protect children, neighbors risking safety to hide escapees, and entire communities quietly resisting oppression. Resistance also took subtler forms. Work slowdowns, deliberate mistakes, and the preservation of language, music, and storytelling were acts of rebellion. Religion offered solace and strategy. Enslaved preachers embedded messages of hope and instructions for escape in sermons, while literacy, though forbidden, was secretly taught to children. Each act of learning, each act of maintaining identity was defiance, a refusal to allow oppression to erase humanity. The Civil War decades later highlighted the extraordinary resilience of enslaved people. Many fled to Union lines, contributing as laborers, guides, and soldiers. Their fight for personal freedom became intertwined with the nation's struggle for unity. In escaping and resisting, they reshaped the moral and political landscape. Emancipation did not erase the horrors endured, but it recognized, however partially, the humanity and courage of those who had endured. Despite legal freedom, the legacy of slavery persisted. Freed people faced violence, systemic oppression, discriminatory laws, and economic exclusion, yet communities were built, schools founded, churches established, and a culture of perseverance continued to thrive. The bravery of enslaved people had created the foundation upon which future generations would continue the fight for equality and justice. The tension between revolutionary ideals and the existence of slavery haunted the new nation. Leaders who celebrated liberty often owned human beings. Declarations of universal rights coexisted with chains and whips. This contradiction fueled political debates, abolitionist movements, and ultimately the Civil War. True, bravery was defined not only by the struggle for survival, but by the unwavering assertion of humanity in a society that sought to deny it. Stories of courage were not limited to the historically famous. They were in calloused hands, in songs sung softly under the stars, in children learning to read in secret, in parents risking everything to keep families intact. Each act of courage, each quiet defiance, each escape was a critical part of the long journey toward liberty. These stories remind us that heroism is often silent and unseen, yet its effects ripple through generations. Even today, the echoes of this struggle remain. They remind us that freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of opportunity, dignity, and recognition. They teach that bravery is not always a battlefield act, but often the courage to exist fully despite oppression, to hope when hope seems impossible, and to claim one's humanity against a world determined to deny it. The shadow of slavery illuminated the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. From plantations to hidden pathways, from whispered prayers to daring escapes, from subtle acts of defiance to active rebellion, the story of enslaved people is a story of relentless courage. It challenges us to recognize that liberty is fragile and must be actively defended. The American narrative is incomplete without it. Within this shadow, the light of true bravery first burned, a light that continues to guide every generation striving for justice and equality. Even as the nation celebrated independence, enslaved people remained living reminders that freedom, when denied to any, undermines liberty for all. Their perseverance, endurance, and ingenuity forged a moral compass that future movements would follow, from abolitionists to civil rights leaders. They demonstrated that courage is not the absence of oppression, but the willingness to resist it, to dream, to act, and to hope in the face of impossible odds. The legacy of slavery is long and painful, but within it hope endured. Those who endured created legacies of courage that outlived chains and whips, that withstood oppression and fear. They taught that liberty is never freely given, that dignity is preserved through struggle, and that hope can ignite movements that change nations. The courage of enslaved people became a cornerstone of America's moral evolution, reminding us that freedom is incomplete unless it is universal. The shadow of slavery, dark and vast as it was also the source of extraordinary heroism. In secret fields, along hidden paths, through whispered prayers, the essence of bravery was defined not by swords or declarations, but by the unyielding human spirit. It was courage born of necessity, sharpened by oppression and sustained by hope. It was the courage to dream of freedom, even when born into chains. And it is a courage that continues to echo today, teaching us that liberty, justice, and equality are ongoing struggles. Struggles that demand bravery, resilience, and unwavering hope. The shadow of slavery reminds us that true freedom requires vigilance, moral courage, and a refusal to accept injustice. It teaches us that the human spirit, when committed to freedom and dignity, can overcome even the darkest of oppression. From the quiet defiance of daily survival to the daring escapes that risked everything, the story of enslaved people is a story of extraordinary courage. It challenges every generation to confront injustice wherever it exists, to act when action is difficult, and to hold fast to hope when despair threatens to prevail. Within the shadow of slavery, the truest definition of bravery emerged. The courage to assert one's humanity against the cruelest odds, to dream when dreams were forbidden, and to fight for freedom, even when the world demanded submission. The shadow of slavery is long, but its lessons endure. It is a story of endurance, resistance, ingenuity, and hope. It is a story that defines the moral and spiritual landscape of America. It is a reminder that freedom, to be meaningful, must include all people. And it is a reminder that courage is not always loud but often quiet, persistent, and unyielding. In hidden fields, secret paths, and whispered prayers, bravery was forged. It was the courage to resist, to hope, to survive, and to claim humanity in the face of oppression. It was a courage that shaped a nation, inspired generations, and continues to echo across time. A reminder that freedom, once dreamed in chains, can endure forever. Brother against brother, state against state, the Civil War was not only a battle for territory but a battle for the very soul of a nation. It was a conflict that forced America to confront its own contradictions, its ideals of liberty, and the cruel realities of human bondage. Over 600,000 lives were lost in a struggle to answer a profound question: can a nation founded on the principle of freedom survive when it denies freedom to millions? The Union was preserved, but the wounds of that war still bleed through the veins of modern America. The story of the Civil War is a story of courage and horror, of human endurance, of ideological conviction, and of the price a nation pays when it divides against itself. From the earliest years of the Republic, the question of slavery had haunted the United States. The Constitution, a remarkable achievement of compromise, left unresolved the question of human bondage, embedding in law a moral contradiction that would fester for decades. The economy of the South was built on slavery, producing cotton, tobacco, and wealth that enriched few while enslaving many. The North industrialized and slowly moved toward wage labor, social reform, and abolitionist sentiment. The cultural, economic, and political differences between regions grew into a chasm, and by the mid-19th century, compromise was failing. Tensions erupted into violence. Secession began with South Carolina in December 1860, followed by 6 more states. The Confederacy was born, asserting its independence and defending slavery as essential to its way of life. In response, President Abraham Lincoln, committed to preserving the Union, faced an impossible task: to maintain national unity while addressing the moral crisis that slavery represented. Fort Sumter fell in April 1861, marking the official beginning of the war. The nation that had once been united under a single flag was now divided, each side believing passionately in its cause, each willing to shed blood for principles that seemed irreconcilable. The war quickly became a test of endurance, strategy, and willpower. Battles raged from the forests and rivers of the Eastern Theater to the rolling hills and plains of the West. At Bull Run, the nation witnessed the horror of modern warfare. Inexperienced soldiers clashed, chaos reigned, and civilians were forced to confront the brutal reality of combat. As the conflict progressed, it became clear that this would not be a short or glorious war. Casualties mounted, disease spread through camps, and families across the country grieved the loss of sons, brothers, and fathers. The human cost was staggering, and yet the conviction that the Union must be preserved and that slavery must be addressed drove the fight forward. Leadership during the Civil War shaped not only the outcome of battles but the moral direction of the nation. Abraham Lincoln, often isolated and criticized, understood that the stakes were existential. His Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 reframed the war as a fight for human liberty, transforming it from a struggle solely to preserve territory into a moral crusade against the institution of slavery. The proclamation allowed African Americans to join the Union Army, offering formerly enslaved men the opportunity to fight for their freedom and for the preservation of the nation itself. This inclusion of black soldiers was a turning point, morally, strategically, and symbolically, illustrating that freedom and justice could no longer be deferred. Soldiers on both sides endured unimaginable hardships. Union and Confederate armies marched for days without sufficient food, endured freezing winters and sweltering summers, and faced wounds that often became fatal due to poor medical knowledge. Letters from the front reveal the human dimension of the conflict. Young men grappling with fear, grief, and longing. Families torn apart. Soldiers struggling to reconcile their ideals with the horrors they witnessed. Battlefields became landscapes of tragedy, their rivers and fields soaked with the blood of those who believed they were fighting for a higher cause. At Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg, the scale of human suffering was staggering. Each life lost a reminder of the war's profound cost. Amid the chaos, courage emerged in extraordinary ways. Soldiers performed acts of heroism under fire, risking their lives for comrades, for ideals, and for the hope that their sacrifices might bring a better future. Nurses and medics, many of them women, worked tirelessly in makeshift hospitals tending to the wounded and dying, often at the risk of their own health. Harriet Tubman, already legendary from her work on the Underground Railroad, served as a spy, scout, and nurse, demonstrating that bravery transcended the battlefield. Each act of valor, whether on the front lines or in the shadows, helped shape the moral and practical outcomes of the war. The war also forced Americans to confront the harsh realities of slavery. Union armies advancing through the South encountered plantations, witnessing firsthand the brutal conditions endured by enslaved people. Enslaved men and women fled to Union lines whenever possible, seeking refuge and freedom. These refugees, often called contrabands, provided labor, intelligence, and manpower, contributing directly to the Union's war effort. Their courage, in fleeing captivity and aiding the cause of the Union, reshaped the understanding of freedom as a tangible, actionable force rather than a theoretical ideal. Economically, the war devastated regions and transformed industries. Southern agriculture was decimated, infrastructure destroyed, and economies dependent on enslaved labor collapsed. In the North, industry boomed to support the war effort, producing weapons, uniforms, and supplies. The nation's transformation was not only political but economic, a recalibration of the American identity. Communities faced starvation, displacement, and ruin. Yet the commitment to principle, whether Unionist or Confederate, drove perseverance. The human spirit, even amid devastation, endured. The battles themselves were microcosms of the nation's struggle. Gettysburg, often called the turning point, was a clash of ideals as much as armies. Soldiers faced unimaginable firepower, advancing and retreating across fields littered with the wounded and dying. Letters home convey both fear and resolve, men describing the carnage but also the moral imperative to continue. Victory at Gettysburg gave hope to the Union cause, demonstrating that perseverance, strategy, and collective conviction could overcome formidable opposition. The war's conclusion at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865 marked the formal end of hostilities, but it did not erase the trauma. Confederate armies surrendered, but the cost of the conflict lingered. Cities lay in ruins, families mourned, and millions of formerly enslaved people faced the uncertain path of freedom. Abraham Lincoln's assassination weeks later underscored the fragility of unity and the depth of division in the national psyche. The preservation of the Union was a victory, but the moral and social work of Reconstruction had only begun. Reconstruction, while intended to rebuild and integrate the South, faced immense resistance. Newly freed African Americans encountered black codes, violent suppression, and systemic discrimination. The courage required to claim freedom extended beyond the battlefield. as former slaves fought to establish schools, churches, and communities despite hostile conditions. The promise of liberty was fragile, and bravery now took the form of perseverance in the face of social, political, and economic oppression. The Civil War's legacy remains vivid in America today. The wounds, literal, political, and psychological, still inform debates about race, citizenship, and national identity. Monuments, memorials, and history books preserve memory, but the human stories of suffering, courage, moral struggle, and perseverance offer deeper lessons. They teach that liberty and unity are not guaranteed, but must be continuously defended, that the price of freedom is often counted in blood, sacrifice, and enduring commitment. Even within families, the war left scars. Brother against brother was not merely a phrase, it was lived experience. Communities were fractured, loyalties divided, and relationships tested. These personal stories highlight the complexity of the conflict. That love, loyalty, and principle were often in tension. That decisions carried profound moral weight. That survival required both courage and sacrifice. African Americans, formerly enslaved, emerged as key agents in defining the nation's future. Their participation in the war as soldiers, laborers, and guides not only shaped military outcomes, but also challenged prevailing notions of citizenship and equality. Each act of service was a claim to humanity, and a declaration that freedom could not be postponed. Their bravery expanded the moral vision of the country, laying the groundwork for civil rights struggles that would continue into the next century. The Civil War was a crucible in which the nation's ideals were tested. Liberty, equality, and unity were not abstract concepts. They were challenged, questioned, and sometimes nearly destroyed. The war demanded moral courage as much as physical bravery. It required leaders willing to make difficult decisions, soldiers willing to risk their lives, and civilians willing to endure privation for the hope of a better future. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of a nation's ideals. Even today, the echoes of that conflict remain. The questions it raised, went about freedom, equality, and the cost of division, are as relevant now as they were then. The Civil War teaches that the preservation of a nation requires both vigilance and moral courage. It demonstrates that unity is not automatic, but must be actively forged and defended. It shows that progress often comes at an unimaginable cost, and that the legacy of struggle shapes every generation that follows. The soldiers who fought, the families who endured, and the leaders who guided the nation through its darkest hours left a legacy of resilience, courage, and moral conviction. Their sacrifices ensured that the United States could emerge as a nation committed, at least in principle, to the ideals of freedom and equality. The Civil War within America was not merely a historical event. It was a defining moment that continues to inform the nation's conscience and identity. In the end, the war answered the question of survival. The Union endured. But the deeper work, reconciliation, justice, and equality, continues. The bravery demonstrated on the battlefield, in homes, and in the lives of formerly enslaved people reminds us that the fight for the soul of a nation is ongoing. It is a call to confront injustice wherever it exists, to uphold freedom wherever it is threatened, and to recognize that the cost of division is profound, yet the reward of unity and liberty is priceless. The Civil War within was more than a conflict over territory. It was a crucible of morality, courage, and endurance. It revealed the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human valor. It demanded sacrifice, tested ideals, and reshaped a nation's identity. Its lessons endure: that freedom is fragile, that unity must be defended, that moral courage is indispensable, and that the human spirit can prevail even in the darkest of times. Brother against brother, State against state. The Civil War was more than a contest for territory. It was a battle for the soul of America itself. The nation that had been forged in the fires of revolution and proclaimed liberty and justice for all was now tearing itself apart. Over 600,000 lives were lost in a struggle to answer a haunting question. Can a nation founded on freedom survive when it denies freedom to millions? The Union was preserved, but the scars of that conflict continue to echo across time, shaping the moral and political consciousness of the country. The seeds of division were sown long before the first shot at Fort Sumter. From the earliest days of the Republic, the institution of slavery cast a shadow over the promise of liberty. The Constitution, a remarkable achievement in compromise, left unresolved the question of human bondage, embedding a moral contradiction that would fester for decades. The Southern economy relied heavily on enslaved labor to produce cotton, tobacco, and other cash crops, generating wealth for a few while oppressing millions. In contrast, the Northern states increasingly embraced wage labor, industrialization, and growing movements for social reform and abolition. These economic and cultural differences, intertwined with debates over states' rights and federal authority, created a rift that eventually could not be bridged by compromise. Tensions erupted in the 1850s. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, the violence in Bleeding, Kansas, and the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin inflamed emotions on both sides. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, a candidate opposed to the expansion of slavery, triggered secession. South Carolina led the way, declaring its departure from the Union in December of that year, followed by 6 more states to form the Confederate States of America. The Confederacy insisted on its independence and defended slavery as essential to its social and economic order. For Lincoln, preserving the Union was a matter of principle, morality, and survival. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the war had officially begun, a violent reckoning over the nation's ideals and contradictions. The early battles revealed the scope of the challenge. At Bull Run, both soldiers and civilians witnessed the horrors of modern war for the first time. Undisciplined militias clashed with trained soldiers. Confusion and panic spread, casualties mounted. The myth of a short, glorious war evaporated. As the conflict escalated, it became clear that survival, strategy, and human endurance would define the course of the nation. Families across the country grieved sons, brothers, and fathers lost in battle, while soldiers endured hunger, disease, and the relentless stress of combat. Letters home captured the emotional turmoil. Young men describing the terror of battle, the camaraderie of soldiers, and the moral weight of fighting against fellow countrymen. Leadership during the Civil War tested both skill and conscience. Abraham Lincoln faced criticism from all sides, navigating political pressure, military setbacks, and the ever-present threat to the Union. His Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863, reframed the conflict as a moral crusade against slavery, transforming the war's purpose. The proclamation declared enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be free and allowed African Americans to join the Union Army, giving formerly enslaved men the chance to fight for their liberation. This radical inclusion reshaped the moral and strategic landscape of the war, demonstrating that freedom was not a theoretical ideal but a tangible, actionable force. The battlefield was a theater of both horror and heroism. Soldiers endured extreme hardships, frigid winters, sweltering summers, inadequate supplies, and primitive medical care. Disease claimed more lives than bullets, and amputations were common for even minor injuries. Yet amidst the suffering, courage manifested in extraordinary ways. Soldiers risked their lives to save comrades, charged into enemy fire to achieve objectives and maintained hope despite overwhelming odds. Women served as nurses, medics, and aid workers in field hospitals, often risking their lives to tend to the wounded and dying. Harriet Tubman, already famed for her work with the Underground Railroad, served as a scout, spy, and nurse, demonstrating that bravery extended far beyond conventional battlefields. The Civil War forced Americans to confront the reality of slavery in profound ways. As Union armies advanced through the South, they encountered plantations and the brutal living conditions of enslaved people. Men, women, and children fled to Union lines whenever possible, seeking refuge and freedom. These contrabands became integral to the war effort, performing labor, providing intelligence, and serving as soldiers. Their courage, or fleeing captivity, facing the unknown and risking death, reshaped the understanding of freedom as something immediate and actionable. Each escape challenged the moral and political framework of the nation, reinforcing the message that liberty could not be deferred. Economically, the war devastated both regions. The Southern economy, dependent on enslaved labor, was crippled by battlefield destruction and the collapse of plantation systems. Railroads, bridges, and cities were destroyed, leaving civilians in poverty and chaos. In the North, industry surged to meet wartime needs, producing weapons, uniforms, and supplies. Communities were transformed, and ordinary citizens, women, children, laborers, contributed to the war effort in crucial ways. Despite suffering and deprivation, the human spirit endured, sustained by the belief in the moral and political necessity of the Union's preservation. Major battles became defining moments, both militarily and morally. Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg demonstrated the intensity of modern warfare, with staggering casualties and acts of heroism. Gettysburg, often considered the turning point of the war, was a confrontation that tested both strategy and morale. Soldiers advanced across open fields under relentless fire, witnessing the devastation of comrades and the horrors of combat. Letters from these battles reveal the inner conflict of soldiers. Fear mingled with duty, despair countered by determination, and grief intertwined with hope. These stories humanize the war, illustrating that the fight was as much about ideals and endurance as it was about territory. The war also highlighted the bravery of formerly enslaved people, who actively participated in shaping the nation's future. African Americans enlisted in the Union Army and Navy, often facing discrimination, inferior equipment, and greater risk of execution if captured by Confederate forces. Yet they fought with determination, proving their capacity for valor and reinforcing the moral purpose of the conflict. Each act of service was a declaration of humanity, a demand for recognition, and a tangible step toward equality. Their contribution changed the trajectory of the war and helped ensure that freedom became more than an abstract ideal. The human cost of the Civil War cannot be overstated. Over 600,000 lives were lost, countless families were torn apart, and cities were reduced to ruins. Yet the lessons learned were profound. The war demonstrated that unity requires vigilance, that freedom carries responsibilities, and that moral courage is essential to preserve a nation's ideals. Personal stories of soldiers' sacrifices, nurses' tireless work, and formerly enslaved people asserting their freedom illuminate the depth of human endurance and the importance of principles over expediency. Even within families, the war's divisions were deeply personal. Brother fought against brother. Friends turned against friends. Communities were fractured. Loyalty was tested, and ordinary people had to navigate complex moral landscapes. These personal narratives reveal the complexity of the Civil War. Love and loyalty intertwined with principle, fear coexisting with courage, and humanity persisting amidst brutality. The war concluded at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, where Confederate forces formally surrendered, yet the conflict's consequences endured long after the final shots. Abraham Lincoln's assassination underscored the fragility of unity and the depth of division within the nation. The challenges of Reconstruction, including integrating formerly enslaved people into society, establishing political rights, and rebuilding a shattered economy, demonstrated that winning the war was only the beginning. The true work of preserving liberty and justice would continue for generations. Reconstruction revealed both progress and resistance. African Americans established schools, churches, and communities, laying the foundation for future generations to claim their rights. Yet they faced violent backlash, discriminatory laws, and systemic barriers. The bravery required to claim freedom extended beyond the battlefield. It demanded perseverance, intellect, and unyielding hope. The struggle for equality became a moral and social battle, demonstrating that courage is not only measured in combat, but in daily acts of survival, education, and civic engagement. The legacy of the Civil War resonates to this day. Monuments and memorials preserve memory. But the lived experiences of soldiers, civilians, and formerly enslaved people offer deeper lessons. They remind us that freedom is not guaranteed, that unity must be actively defended, and that moral courage is essential in confronting injustice. The cost of division is immense, yet the reward of liberty and justice is enduring. Ultimately, the Civil War tested the nation's ideals of freedom, equality, and unity. It demanded extraordinary courage from soldiers on both sides, from leaders navigating moral dilemmas, from civilians enduring deprivation, and from African Americans claiming their right to be recognized as fully human. It forced Americans to confront the profound contradictions between the nation's principles and its practices. The preservation of the Union was a monumental achievement, but it came at an unimaginable cost. The wounds of the conflict, social, political, and emotional, persisted long after the last battle. Yet the bravery and sacrifices of those who lived through the war created the foundation for future progress, laying the groundwork for civil rights movements, social reform, and the ongoing struggle to align America's ideals with its realities. The Civil War within America was more than a military conflict. It was a moral crucible, a test of human endurance and a confrontation with the nation's deepest contradictions. It demanded sacrifice, courage, and reflection. It reshaped the country, leaving lessons that continue to resonate. That freedom requires vigilance, that unity is fragile, that moral courage is indispensable, and that the human spirit can prevail even in the darkest of times. Though the Union survived, the work of reconciliation, justice, and equality continues. The legacy of the war calls upon each generation to confront injustice, defend liberty, and pursue a more perfect union. The bravery demonstrated on battlefields, in homes, and in the lives of formerly enslaved people reminds us that the struggle for the soul of a nation is ongoing. It teaches that liberty and equality are not abstract concepts, but responsibilities that demand action, courage, and perseverance. The Civil War within America ultimately revealed both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human valor. It showed that courage is not only measured by physical acts of bravery, but also by moral conviction, endurance, and the willingness to confront injustice. It taught that freedom, though fragile and contested, can be preserved through sacrifice, vigilance, and the relentless pursuit of principle. From the earliest days of the Republic, brave individuals refused to accept injustice as inevitable. From the suffragettes marching through the streets, to civil rights leaders facing fire hoses and angry mobs, to activists whose names have become synonymous with courage, the story of social change in America is a story of voices that refused silence, These voices remind us that bravery evolves not only on battlefields but in streets, in courtrooms, in classrooms, and in the hearts of those who demand fairness. Rosa Parks, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass. Each of them stood unarmed yet unstoppable. Their fight was never for recognition or fame. It was for justice, dignity, and the unwavering belief that inequality is neither natural nor acceptable. The struggle for suffrage, for the right to vote, exemplifies the early fight against systemic injustice. Women, long denied political agency, understood that democracy was meaningless unless all citizens could participate. In the mid-19th century, activists such as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott organized, petitioned, and marched to demand representation. Their courage was often met with ridicule, imprisonment, and public scorn. Yet they persisted. Each speech, each petition, each protest was a declaration that silence was not an option. Women risked social ostracism and legal consequences simply to assert their humanity and demand recognition as full citizens. Frederick Douglass, born into slavery, emerged as one of the most powerful voices in 19th century America. Escaping bondage did not mark the end of his fight. It was only the beginning. Through speeches, writings, and advocacy, he challenged the moral conscience of a nation. He confronted audiences with unflinching truth, that slavery was a stain upon American ideals, that freedom demanded accountability, and that courage was necessary not only to survive, but to transform society. Douglass's insistence on education, moral persuasion, and persistent advocacy demonstrated that protest could take many forms, not only through confrontation, but through intellect and unyielding moral clarity. The post-Civil War era did not bring immediate equality. Reconstruction promised rights for formerly enslaved people, but systemic oppression and violence quickly sought to silence them. Jim Crow laws, lynching, and disenfranchisement created new barriers to freedom, yet voices refused to be silenced. Activists, organizers, and everyday citizens found ways to resist, forming churches, creating schools, organizing labor, and using the power of the press to expose injustice. Bravery evolved from survival to strategic resistance, demonstrating that the fight for fairness required ingenuity, persistence, and solidarity. In the early 20th century, the suffrage movement intensified. Women across the country staged marches, hunger strikes, and civil disobedience. In 1917, when activists were arrested for picketing the White House, their courage inspired national attention. They endured brutal treatment in prisons, yet their resolve never wavered. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, was not granted out of benevolence. It was demanded through decades of relentless advocacy, sacrifice, and bravery. Every vote cast thereafter was a testament to the courage of those who refused to remain invisible. The fight for civil rights in the mid-20th century took the lessons of previous generations and transformed them into mass movements. African Americans facing systemic segregation, economic inequality, and violent repression mobilized to demand justice. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Medgar Evers understood that courage was not merely the absence of fear, but the persistence to act despite it. Rosa Parks's refusal to surrender her bus seat was a singular act of defiance, but its impact reverberated across a nation. It sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, demonstrating that collective action grounded in moral conviction could confront entrenched injustice. Nonviolent protest became both a tactic and a philosophy. Marches, sit-ins, and boycotts were designed to expose the moral contradictions of segregation and oppression. Activists faced harassment, imprisonment, and physical violence, yet their courage was unshakable. Each act of defiance, whether a student participating in a lunch counter sit-in or a minister leading a march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, represented a refusal to accept injustice as normal. Bravery was measured not in weapons or armies but in the willingness to endure suffering for the sake of change. The struggle extended beyond the South. Discrimination in the North, inequities in housing, education, and employment, and systemic exclusion from political power demonstrated that the fight for equality was nationwide. Organizations like the NACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee coordinated campaigns to challenge injustice at multiple levels. Leaders trained ordinary citizens in the art of moral courage, the ability to act with integrity, to resist intimidation, and to demand justice without succumbing to fear. Media played a critical role in amplifying these voices. Photographs of police dogs attacking peaceful protesters, of children hosed with water, of families demonstrating in the face of hatred, exposed the brutality of segregation to the broader public. Television broadcasts brought distant suffering into homes across the country, creating a moral imperative for action. The courage of those who stood firm in the face of violence became visible, inspiring allies and building momentum for legislative change. The bravery of these movements was multi-generational. Women's suffrage, abolition, and civil rights were not isolated campaigns. They were part of an ongoing struggle to expand justice and recognition. Each generation built upon the sacrifices of the previous one. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were victories. But they were not gifts. They were the culmination of decades of bravery, strategic protest, and relentless advocacy. The victories of one era became the foundation for the next, as each generation refused to accept silence as an option. Voices of protest also came from unexpected places. Ordinary citizens, clergy, teachers, students, and laborers contributed to the struggle for justice. Bravery was not limited to leaders. It was found in every person who risked safety, reputation, or livelihood to speak truth to power. Teachers educated children in segregated schools. Nurses treated the injured during protests, and community organizers mobilized citizens to vote, protest, and advocate. Each act of courage, whether large or small, contributed to a collective insistence that injustice must be confronted. The fight for equality was also deeply personal. Families faced threats and violence simply for asserting their rights. Children were arrested for participating in marches. Mothers and fathers worried about the safety of their loved ones while encouraging them to act. This intersection of personal risk and moral responsibility defined the courage of the era. To protest was to expose oneself to danger, to endure humiliation, and to confront entrenched power structures. Yet the choice to remain silent was considered a moral failure, a complicity in injustice. Voices refused silence in the face of systemic oppression, but they also demanded change through legal means. Court cases, petitions, and legislative advocacy complemented street protests. Lawyers, judges, and politicians were challenged to confront the contradictions between the nation's ideals and its practices. Courage manifested in the courtroom as well as on the streets, as advocates fought to expand constitutional protections, enforce civil rights legislation, and challenge discriminatory policies. Even after landmark victories, the struggle continued. Discrimination did not vanish overnight. Social, economic, and political inequalities persisted. Activists recognized that change was incremental and ongoing, requiring vigilance and persistence. The bravery of Rosa Parks, Frederick Douglass, and Susan B. Anthony set a standard for future generations. Courage is measured by the refusal to accept injustice, by the persistence to act, and by the willingness to endure suffering in pursuit of fairness. The voices that refused silence taught that activism requires moral clarity, strategy, and endurance. Bravery is not always dramatic. It is often quiet, steady, and sustained. It is the persistence to speak truth even when ignored, the resolve to march forward even when threatened, and the determination to educate, organize, and mobilize even when progress seems slow. These voices remind us that history is shaped by those who refuse to remain passive, by those who recognize that change is not granted, it is demanded. Across the nation, monuments and memorials preserve the memory of these struggles, but the true legacy lies in the lessons they provide. Each act of protest, each campaign for justice, each refusal to remain silent contributes to an ongoing narrative. That equality is not automatic, that freedom is incomplete without justice, and that courage takes many forms. From the streets of Montgomery to the halls of Congress, from the speeches of leaders to the actions of ordinary citizens, bravery has been the engine of social change. Education, too, became a battlefield. Activists fought not only for political rights but also for the right to learn, to access knowledge, and to develop minds capable of challenging oppression. Literacy programs, advocacy for equal schools, and the insistence that knowledge empowers were all part of the broader struggle. Education was both a tool and an act of resistance. Those who taught, learned, and mentored were as courageous as those marching in the streets, for they knew that the future depended upon an informed and empowered populace. The voices that refused silence remind us that change is cumulative. Each generation builds upon the efforts of the previous one, taking lessons from victories and setbacks alike. Courage is a legacy, passed down through stories, teachings, and example. Activists learn from suffragettes, civil rights leaders learn from abolitionists, and modern movements continue to draw inspiration from these historic struggles. The fight for justice is ongoing, and bravery remains central to its progress. Ultimately, the story of protest in America is a story of hope intertwined with courage. Rosa Parks, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, and countless others whose names may be forgotten, demonstrate that fairness is not given, it is demanded. Their bravery transformed society, challenged entrenched power, and reshaped the moral landscape. Their refusal to remain silent shows that change is possible when ordinary people recognize their power to act, to organize, and to insist that injustice cannot stand unchallenged. The voices that refused silence are a testament to the enduring power of courage in the pursuit of justice. They teach that protest is not only an act of defiance but a form of moral leadership. They remind us that true bravery is unarmed, persistent, and rooted in conviction. And they affirm that progress, though often slow and difficult, is achievable when people refuse to accept silence in the face of injustice. From the earliest days of the Republic, brave individuals refused to accept injustice as inevitable. While the nation celebrated its ideals of liberty and equality, many citizens were denied the basic rights promised in the Constitution. The story of social change in America is not one of automatic progress but of relentless courage. It is the story of voices that refuse silence. Suffragettes marching in defiance, civil rights leaders facing fire hoses and hatred, and abolitionists confronting a morally corrupt system all remind us that bravery evolves, from survival to protest to transformation. Rosa Parks, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, names etched into history, each stood unarmed yet unstoppable. Their fight was never for recognition or fame. It was for justice, dignity, and the unwavering belief that inequality is neither natural nor acceptable. The struggle for women's suffrage offers a vivid example of courage in the face of systemic oppression. In the mid-19th century, women were denied political agency entirely, barred from voting, holding office, or even participating meaningfully in public debates. Leaders such as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Sojourner Truth understood that democracy was meaningless unless all citizens could participate. They organized conventions, drafted petitions, and delivered speeches that challenged deeply entrenched social norms. Their activism was not a polite request. It was a radical assertion that silence was no longer acceptable. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 marked a watershed moment. For 2 days, women debated their rights, declared the injustice of their exclusion, and called for political, legal, and social reforms. Anthony and Stanton's activism extended far beyond the convention. They traveled the country, delivering speeches and lobbying legislators, often facing ridicule, arrest, and public scorn. Their courage was not abstract. It demanded personal sacrifice. Women endured social ostracism, economic vulnerability, and physical danger to make their voices heard. Each petition, each protest, each public speech became a moral statement. Equality would not be delayed, nor would it be denied. Parallel to the women's suffrage movement, abolitionist voices challenged the greatest moral failing of the United States: slavery. Frederick Douglass, born into bondage, escaped to freedom only to continue the fight for justice. Through impassioned speeches, autobiographies, and political advocacy, Douglass confronted the moral conscience of the nation. He reminded Americans that liberty was hollow if it excluded millions from its promise. His insistence on education, moral persuasion, and unwavering advocacy demonstrated that protest could take many forms, not only through confrontation, but through intellect and moral clarity. His courage set a precedent. The struggle for justice required both voice and action. The post-Civil War era did not bring immediate equality. Freed people faced black codes, violent suppression, and systemic disenfranchisement. The courage required to survive and resist oppression was immense. Activists, organizers, and everyday citizens found ways to reclaim agency, forming churches, creating schools, organizing labor, and using the power of newspapers and pamphlets to expose injustice. Bravery evolved from survival to strategic resistance, showing that the fight for fairness required ingenuity, persistence, and solidarity. In the early 20th century, the suffrage movement intensified. Women staged marches, hunger strikes, and acts of civil disobedience. In 1917, suffragists picketing the White House were arrested and imprisoned. They endured harsh treatment and forced feeding but remained resolute. Their sacrifices culminated in the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Voting rights were won not through benevolence, but through decades of relentless advocacy. Every ballot cast by women thereafter was a testament to the bravery of those who refused to remain invisible. Meanwhile, racial injustice persisted across the country. Segregation, economic inequality, and systematic exclusion of African Americans from political power reinforced oppression. Leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and Booker T. Washington sought to confront these injustices through education, journalism, and advocacy. Wells, for instance, exposed the horrors of lynching in the 1890s, risking her life to reveal the truth. African Americans who demanded justice were met with violence, intimidation, and assassination. Each act of resistance, whether through journalism, organization, or protest, required immense courage. The mid-20th century civil rights movement transformed these individual acts of bravery into mass movements. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, John Lewis, and countless others demonstrated that moral courage could be amplified by collective action. Rosa Parks' refusal to surrender her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955 became a symbolic spark, igniting the Montgomery bus boycott. Her act of defiance illustrated that bravery is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, steadfast, and principled. The boycott itself demanded coordination, endurance, and resilience. African Americans refused to ride segregated buses for over a year, facing harassment, economic reprisals, and threats to their safety. The courage displayed by entire communities exemplified the power of unified moral action. Nonviolent resistance became both a tactic and a philosophy. Sit-ins at lunch counters, marches across bridges, and demonstrations in public spaces exposed the moral contradictions of segregation. Protesters faced police brutality, imprisonment, and intimidation. High school and college students risked physical harm to occupy spaces of injustice. Leaders taught that courage was not the absence of fear, but the persistence to act despite it. The bravery of these citizens was a direct challenge to systemic oppression, showing the world that moral force could outweigh physical power. Media amplified these acts of courage. Photographs of children hosed by police, of peaceful protesters attacked by dogs, and of families enduring brutality exposed the stark realities of segregation to national and international audiences. Television broadcasts brought distant suffering into homes across the country, transforming local resistance into a global moral issue. The courage of ordinary citizens, captured and shared widely, inspired allies, shifted public opinion, and pressured political leaders to act. These movements were sustained by multi-generational bravery. Suffragists, abolitionists, and civil rights leaders shared a common understanding. Injustice will not resolve itself. Each generation built upon the struggles of the previous, passing lessons in strategy, endurance, and moral clarity. Legal victories such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were not gifts. They were the culmination of decades of risk, sacrifice, and principled action. The victories of one era became the foundation for the next, demonstrating that courage is a legacy, not an accident. Bravery extended beyond leaders to ordinary citizens. Clergy, teachers, students, and laborers contributed to the fight for justice. Each act of defiance, teaching in segregated schools, volunteering in protests, mentoring the next generation, was a claim to human dignity. Courage manifested in every act that resisted oppression, whether visible or hidden. Every individual who refused to accept injustice added weight to a collective moral imperative. Silence is complicity. Protest was also deeply personal. Families faced threats simply for asserting their rights. Children were jailed for participating in demonstrations. Parents worried but also encouraged action, recognizing that the moral weight of courage required risk. The interplay between personal fear and moral duty defined the bravery of the era. To act was to confront entrenched systems, to endure possible harm, and to assert humanity in the face of oppression. Legal battles complemented street activism. Court cases, petitions, and legislative advocacy challenged structural injustice. Lawyers and activists confronted institutions, holding government and private actors accountable for their actions. Courage was not only physical but intellectual, moral, and strategic. Bravery was demonstrated in the courtroom, the classroom, and the press as much as in the streets. Even after landmark legislation, the struggle continued. Discrimination, inequality, and systemic barriers persisted. Each generation of activists understood that progress is incremental and requires vigilance. The courage of Rosa Parks, Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, and countless unnamed participants demonstrates that bravery is sustained, persistent, and principled. History is shaped by those who refuse to remain silent, insisting that injustice cannot stand unchallenged. The fight for justice also included education. Activists emphasized literacy, knowledge, and critical thinking as tools of liberation. Schools, community centers, and mentorship programs became battlegrounds for equality. Teaching, learning, and empowerment were acts of resistance. demonstrating that courage extends beyond protest to the creation of opportunity and agency. Voices refused silence, demanded justice, and reshaped society. They remind us that change is not granted. It is fought for, demanded, and defended. Bravery is unarmed, persistent, and moral. It manifests in acts both public and private, large and small, dramatic and quiet. The story of protest in America is a story of endurance, vision, and moral conviction, proving that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary transformation. Ultimately, the legacy of these voices is a call to action. Each generation inherits the responsibility to confront injustice, amplify marginalized voices, and uphold principles of fairness and equality. The courage of past activists serves as both inspiration and blueprint, teaching that liberty, equality, and justice are sustained only through persistence, moral clarity, and action. The voices that refuse silence are a testament to the enduring power of human courage. They teach that protest is not merely an act of defiance but a moral imperative. They remind us that bravery is often quiet, steady, and rooted in conviction. And they affirm that progress, though slow and difficult, is possible when people refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. From the streets, to courtrooms, to classrooms, the story of social change is defined by those who dared to speak, march, and demand justice. Every ballot cast, every speech delivered, every protest endured is a continuation of the legacy of bravery. It is a reminder that history belongs to those who refuse to accept oppression, and that change is achieved by those willing to act with courage, clarity, and moral resolve. From the moment they set foot on distant shores, immigrants to America carried with them hopes, fears, and determination that would define generations. Every journey was both literal and symbolic, a crossing from the familiar into the unknown, from survival into the pursuit of opportunity. They faced oceans and continents, storms and disease, prejudice and suspicion, but they endured. Every generation encountered new walls, literal in the form of Ellis Island and Angel Island, and invisible in the form of discrimination, economic hardship, and cultural barriers. Yet every immigrant who refused to quit became a thread in the unbreakable fabric of the nation. Their sweat, sacrifice, and ingenuity shaped the backbone of industry, the vibrancy of culture, and the forward momentum of American progress. The story begins long before the Statue of Liberty welcomed newcomers to the harbor of New York. Immigrants came from Europe, Asia, Latin America, and beyond. Drawn by the promise of work, safety, or freedom, they were farmers, artisans, scholars, and laborers, each leaving behind homes, languages, and communities to build new lives. Their journeys were not easy. Ships were crowded and unsanitary, and disease claimed many before they even reached land. Families were separated, possessions lost, and uncertainty accompanied every step. Yet the promise of possibility, however uncertain, propelled them forward. Ellis Island, opened in 1892, became the gateway for millions of European immigrants. Here, hopes collided with bureaucracy, health inspections, and legal scrutiny. Names were anglicized, personal histories condensed into single lines on official documents, and families were interrogated about their intentions, skills, and health. Many arrived with nothing but a small suitcase, a few coins, and the clothes on their backs. Some were immediately sent back due to illness or suspicion, a harsh reminder that the pursuit of opportunity came with risk. For those who passed through, Ellis Island became the starting point of a new identity, a liminal space between the old world and the new, where courage and perseverance were tested daily. In the burgeoning cities of the United States, immigrants faced intense hardship. Tenement housing was overcrowded and unsanitary. Wages were low and work was often dangerous. Yet immigrants labored in factories, sweatshops, and on construction sites, building the infrastructure of modern America. They dug canals, laid railroads, harvested crops, and worked in mills that hummed with the sounds of industry. Their toil powered the nation's economy, while shaping the social and cultural landscape. Despite discrimination and nativist hostility, immigrant communities developed schools, religious institutions, newspapers, and mutual aid societies, preserving traditions while adapting to a new environment. Asian immigrants, particularly Chinese and Japanese laborers, faced legal exclusion and racial prejudice. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 barred most Chinese laborers from entering the country, yet many persisted, creating communities in Chinatowns and contributing to the building of railroads and agriculture. Angel Island in San Francisco Bay became the West Coast counterpart to Ellis Island, where immigrants endured long detentions and intense questioning, often reflecting the racial biases of the era. Despite these obstacles, Asian communities preserved their heritage, educated their children, and built businesses that contributed to the economy and cultural diversity of the United States. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Poles, Russians, and others, faced discrimination from established populations, yet they brought skills, culture, and resilience. Italian immigrants built neighborhoods that became culinary and cultural hubs. Polish immigrants contributed to industry and labor movements. Jewish immigrants fleeing pogroms and persecution brought traditions, literacy, and entrepreneurial energy, establishing businesses, newspapers, and cultural institutions that enriched American life. Each wave of immigrants encountered skepticism, hostility, and systemic barriers, yet they persisted, transforming adversity into opportunity. The pursuit of the American dream was not linear. Immigrants experienced cycles of hope and hardship, often navigating multiple challenges at once. Children worked alongside parents in factories or mines, learning both the value of labor and the cost of survival. Entire families endured poverty, illness, and social marginalization, yet they maintained aspirations for education, property ownership, and social mobility. Success was measured not by immediate comfort, but by incremental gains. A home, literacy, a job that allowed children to dream of something more. Each small victory was a testament to resilience and determination. Labor movements were a defining aspect of immigrant life. Faced with exploitation, long hours, and unsafe conditions, immigrants organized strikes, unions, and protests to demand fair treatment. The Pullman strike, the Lawrence textile strike, and numerous local labor actions demonstrated both the courage and strategic thinking of immigrant communities. Men, women, and children participated, risking arrest, injury, and social reprisal. These struggles were not only about wages or hours. They were battles for dignity, recognition, and the ability to claim their place in a society that often sought to marginalize them. Cultural contribution was another pillar of immigrant resilience. Immigrants brought languages, cuisine, music, and religious traditions that enriched American society. Festivals, parades, and religious ceremonies became both acts of preservation and assertions of identity. Newspapers and community centers allowed immigrants to communicate, educate, and advocate for themselves. Through culture, immigrants resisted erasure, asserting that their presence was not a temporary inconvenience but a permanent, vital part of the nation. Immigrants also played a pivotal role in the evolution of industry and infrastructure. Irish laborers dug canals, built railways, and worked in construction, physically shaping the cities and transportation networks that fueled economic growth. Italian and German immigrants brought craftsmanship, establishing small businesses, bakeries, and artisan shops. Chinese laborers completed the transcontinental railroad, connecting the continent and enabling commerce that would define the American economy. Each contribution, often unacknowledged at the time, was foundational to the nation's development. Immigrant life was intertwined with education. Parents sought schools for their children, understanding that literacy, skill, and knowledge were pathways to upward mobility. Settlement houses, such as Hull House in Chicago, provided resources for education, employment, and civic engagement. Educators, activists, and reformers worked with immigrant families to navigate the complexities of urban life, teaching language, civic responsibility, and cultural adaptation. Education became both a tool for survival and a vehicle for empowerment, bridging the gap between the old world and the new. The 20th century introduced new waves of immigrants and new challenges. Political upheavals, wars, and economic crises in Europe, Asia, and Latin America sent millions to American shores. Quotas, immigration restrictions, and xenophobic policies often hindered access, yet determination remained undiminished. Families migrated, sometimes in stages, enduring separation and uncertainty. Their resilience reshaped neighborhoods, revitalized industries, and infused American society with diversity and innovation. Each immigrant generation faced skepticism, yet each contributed to the nation's growth in profound ways. During the Great Depression, immigrants experienced particular hardship. Jobs disappeared, wages plummeted, and communities struggled to survive. Yet even in the darkest times, immigrant families adapted. They pooled resources, supported one another, and sought creative solutions. Community solidarity became a survival mechanism, emphasizing cooperation, mutual aid, and shared resilience. The hardships of the era forged bonds that would last generations and strengthened the capacity for perseverance. World Wars I and II further highlighted immigrant contributions. Many immigrants enlisted in the military, fighting alongside native-born Americans to defend the nation. Their service often contradicted prevailing prejudices, proving loyalty and courage under fire. On the home front, immigrants worked in war industries producing weapons, vehicles, and essential goods. Their labor and sacrifice were indispensable to national survival, underscoring the integral role immigrants played in shaping the nation's destiny. Post-war periods brought both opportunity and new challenges. Suburbanization, economic expansion, and civil rights movements created avenues for upward mobility. Yet immigrants still faced discrimination and cultural barriers. Latino immigrants, particularly from Mexico and Central America, contributed to agriculture, construction, and urban labor markets, often under difficult conditions. Asian immigrants, following the repeal of exclusionary laws, pursued education, business, and professional careers, enriching communities and advancing economic growth. Each group negotiated its identity, striving to preserve culture while integrating into a broader society. Immigrant contributions to arts, literature, and innovation further demonstrate their lasting impact. Writers, musicians, and artists drew upon their experiences, blending heritage and contemporary culture. Jazz, classical music, cuisine, visual arts, and literature all bear the imprint of immigrant creativity. Scientific and technological advancements, pioneered by immigrants or their descendants, propelled the nation forward. Each achievement represents the fusion of courage, opportunity, and determination, hallmarks of the immigrant journey. The pursuit of the American dream has always been a labor, a struggle, and an act of courage. Success was never guaranteed. Comfort was never assured. Each generation faced new obstacles, from restrictive laws to social prejudice to economic instability. Yet through persistence, ingenuity, and unyielding hope, immigrants carved a place for themselves and their descendants. Every immigrant who refused to quit became a living testament to resilience, embodying the principle that opportunity is not given but earned through effort. sacrifice, and determination. Stories of immigrants are stories of family and community. Elders recounted journeys to children. Recipes, songs, and traditions were passed down as acts of preservation. Communities organized cultural events, social clubs, and civic associations, creating networks of support and continuity. These networks not only preserved heritage but empowered new generations to navigate the challenges of assimilation, education, and professional advancement. Bravery was therefore both personal and collective, linking individuals through shared purpose and mutual support. Even today, immigrants continue to confront challenges, whether political, economic, or social, yet their legacy of courage, resilience, and contribution remains central to the nation's identity. Every skyscraper, every cultural festival, every innovation bears the mark of immigrant effort. The American dream remains a pursuit, not a promise, and every immigrant who perseveres adds to the enduring tapestry of the nation. Ultimately, the immigrant journey is a testament to human endurance, vision, and hope. Every wave of newcomers confronted new walls yet refused to be defeated. Every family that crossed oceans, every worker who labored in factories, every student who pursued education despite obstacles, reinforced the principle that opportunity is claimed through action and perseverance. These voices, these lives, these stories, collectively form the backbone of the American narrative. The immigrant's journey reminds us that the nation's strength derives from the courage of those who refuse to quit. Their sweat, sacrifice, and resilience are woven into the very fabric of society. The American dream is not a promise of ease or comfort. It is a pursuit, a challenge, and a testament to human determination. Every immigrant who dared to try, who faced the unknown with hope, became an essential thread in the unbreakable fabric of America. From the earliest days of the nation, America's struggle has been as much internal as it has been external. The wars fought on distant fields, from Lexington and Concord to Iwo Jima, are often remembered, celebrated, and taught in history books. But the truest battles, the ones that define the moral and spiritual backbone of the nation, are waged in the hearts and minds of its citizens. In every age, the nation faces the same question. Will we choose courage over comfort, freedom over fear, principle over expediency? The battlefield is not only abroad, it is in our laws, our communities, and in the silent decisions made in homes, classrooms, and offices across the country. The battle for the soul of freedom is ongoing, relentless, and deeply personal. The Revolution, America's first great test, exemplified this eternal struggle. Ordinary men and women without the wealth, armies, or resources of empires stood against the might of Britain. They faced not only the external threat of a powerful military, but the internal threat of fear and doubt. Every choice to join a militia, to support the cause, to resist coercion, demanded courage. The Declaration of Independence was not a mere document. It was a manifesto written in conviction, defiance, and the willingness to endure sacrifice. Freedom required bravery, not only on the battlefield but in every act of defiance against tyranny, in every quiet act of conscience, and in every decision to uphold principle in the face of fear. Yet the revolution was only the beginning. The young nation confronted internal contradictions almost immediately. The ideals of liberty clashed with the reality of slavery, gender inequality, and disenfranchisement. The question of freedom was not abstract. It demanded moral courage. Leaders and ordinary citizens alike were forced to wrestle with hypocrisy. How could a nation declare liberty while millions remained in bondage? Courage was not simply about resisting an external enemy. It was about confronting uncomfortable truths at home, questioning social norms, and challenging entrenched systems of power. The Civil War represents the ultimate manifestation of this internal battle. Brother fought against brother, state against state, and the nation teetered on the edge of collapse. Over 600,000 lives were lost, each death a painful reminder that freedom is never guaranteed. It must be defended, redefined, and continually chosen. Soldiers on both sides faced not only the physical dangers of battle, but the moral weight of the fight itself. The Union sought to preserve a nation founded on liberty, while grappling with the systemic contradiction of slavery. The bravery required in that era was not only martial, it was ethical, intellectual, and profoundly human. Leaders, soldiers, and citizens were forced to make choices that would define the moral character of the nation for generations. Freedom has never been static. Each generation faces its own tests, from Reconstruction to the civil rights movements of the 20th century. African Americans long denied the fruits of liberty, confronted violence, intimidation, and systemic oppression to claim their rightful place in society. The bravery required was profound: to march, to speak, to vote, to educate, and to resist, often at great personal cost. Rosa Parks's quiet defiance, the courage of students participating in sit-ins, and the leadership of figures like Martin Luther King Jr. demonstrate that the battle for freedom extends far beyond armies and battlefields. It is fought in streets, in schools, and in the very act of insisting on dignity and equality. The struggle for the soul of freedom is also fought in less visible arenas: the ballot box, the courtrooms, and the halls of government. Democracy is not automatic. It requires constant vigilance, courage to speak truth to power, and the willingness to challenge injustice. Voter suppression, political intimidation, and systemic inequality have repeatedly tested the nation's commitment to liberty. Every citizen who chooses to participate, who challenges corruption, or who advocates for fairness becomes a soldier in this ongoing battle. The bravery required here is not measured in gunfire, but in moral clarity, persistence, and the courage to endure criticism or opposition. Bravery also manifests in the quiet decisions made daily, within families, workplaces, and communities. Parents teach their children to uphold principles even when inconvenient. Teachers challenge inequity in education. Activists confront local injustices, and ordinary citizens resist apathy. The soul of freedom is defended in these cumulative acts of conscience, where courage is expressed not only in grand gestures, but in sustained commitment to justice, empathy, and integrity. Freedom is preserved not only by revolutions, but by the ordinary acts of those unwilling to compromise moral principle for comfort or convenience. The 20th century brought new arenas of struggle. The world wars demanded physical courage, yet the home front required moral bravery as well. Immigrants in marginalized communities faced suspicion while contributing to the nation's defense and economy. Internment, discrimination, and prejudice tested the nation's ethical compass. Yet individuals persevered, balancing loyalty to country with advocacy for justice. Civil rights movements, women's suffrage, labor activism, and environmental advocacy all illustrate that freedom is not inherited. It is earned, defended, and renewed through continuous effort and bravery. The Cold War era presented an additional form of internal struggle: the tension between fear and liberty. Ideological conflict, domestic paranoia, and threats to civil liberties challenged citizens to act with courage in the face of coercion. Whistleblowers, activists, and ordinary citizens faced decisions about whether to speak out, resist conformity, or uphold constitutional principles. The battle for freedom is as much about resisting fear as it is about opposing tyranny. Courage is required to maintain integrity when intimidation, surveillance, or social pressure seeks to compromise it. In modern times, the battleground has shifted yet again. Social, political, and technological change brings new challenges to liberty. Issues of inequality, discrimination and systemic oppression continue to demand vigilance and action. Bravery is expressed in advocating for marginalized voices, challenging misinformation, protecting democratic institutions, and standing against corruption. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, contributes to the ongoing defense of freedom. The question remains as urgent today as it did centuries ago. Are we still the land of the brave? The bravery required in this battle is multifaceted. It encompasses physical courage in defense of the nation, moral courage in confronting injustice, and civic courage in participating actively in democracy. Each is vital, and each is tested continuously. Freedom is not a permanent inheritance. It is a living commitment, sustained by those willing to make sacrifices, voice dissent, and act with principle. Courage is not a static trait, but a recurring choice, demanded anew in every era. Historical examples abound. Frederick Douglass challenged the nation's conscience, insisting that liberty was meaningless without justice. Susan B. Anthony risked imprisonment to demand political equality. Martin Luther King Jr. and countless activists endured violence to insist that segregation and discrimination were unacceptable. Each acted knowing that comfort could be sacrificed and fear could be endured in service of a greater principle. The pattern repeats in every generation. Freedom is defended not only by armies but by citizens willing to act, even when the outcome is uncertain. The struggle also tests unity and empathy. The soul of freedom is preserved when citizens recognize the humanity of others, advocate for the disenfranchised, and confront injustice wherever it arises. Silence in the face of oppression is complicity. Participation, courage, and moral clarity are the antidotes. Bravery is required to bridge divides, challenge prejudice, and insist on fairness, even when doing so is uncomfortable or dangerous. This is the internal war that defines the nation. The battle between fear and courage, apathy and action, conformity and principle. Education, civic engagement, and cultural awareness are weapons in this ongoing struggle. Citizens who inform themselves, participate in dialogue, and hold institutions accountable sustain the moral foundation of freedom. The act of questioning, of challenging authority, of resisting oppression, and of advocating for justice is not optional. It is the core of what it means to defend liberty. Each informed, engaged, and courageous individual strengthens the nation's capacity to remain true to its ideals. The battle for freedom also involves confronting history honestly. Recognizing past injustices, acknowledging systemic oppression, and learning from previous struggles allows the nation to avoid repeating errors. Bravery is required to confront uncomfortable truths, to admit mistakes, and to act decisively to correct them. This moral courage is as crucial as any battlefield victory, for it ensures that liberty is aligned with justice, and freedom is inseparable from ethical responsibility. In every era, the nation faces a choice between comfort and courage. It is easier to accept the status quo, to avoid controversy, or to prioritize personal convenience over collective moral responsibility. Yet freedom demands more. It demands action in the face of fear, commitment in the face of uncertainty, and persistence in the face of adversity. Every citizen, in small ways and large, participates in this ongoing battle, choosing either to defend liberty or to allow it to erode. The soul of America is tested not only by wars abroad, but by the daily choices of its people. In the streets, in schools, in workplaces, and in homes, the decisions to uphold justice, resist oppression, and act with courage define the nation's character. Each act of bravery, whether public or private, contributes to a larger mosaic of freedom. The nation's moral health depends on citizens who are willing to act, speak, and persist, even when doing so is inconvenient or dangerous. Ultimately, bravery is a repeated choice. It is not inherited. It is chosen again and again. It is demanded by circumstance, by conscience, and by history. Every generation inherits the mantle of responsibility to defend liberty, confront injustice, and preserve the moral integrity of the nation. The battle for the soul of freedom is never over. It is renewed with every act of courage, every decision to act ethically, and every refusal to surrender to fear or comfort. From the Revolution to the Civil War, from the Civil Rights Movement to contemporary struggles for justice, the lesson is clear. Freedom is not automatic and bravery is not innate. A nation's liberty is measured by the courage of its citizens to choose principle over expediency, action over passivity, and justice over fear. America remains the land of the brave only when each person, in their own way, chooses to be brave. The battle for the soul of freedom is waged in every courtroom, every protest, every vote, and every quiet act of conscience. It is fought by those who risk comfort, security, and popularity to defend what is right. And it is fought by ordinary citizens whose names will never be remembered, but whose courage sustains the nation. Bravery is the glue that holds freedom together. It is the force that ensures that liberty is not hollow, but lived, shared, and enduring. Because the truth is simple. A nation is not born brave. A nation becomes brave only when its people choose courage again and again. Freedom is not a gift, it is a responsibility. And in every generation the question remains, will we choose fear or will we choose bravery? Will we take the easy path or will we defend the soul of our nation? History is watching. The world is watching. And the answer every time lies in the hearts of those willing to stand for what is right. From the very founding of this nation, America's greatest battles have not always been fought abroad. While soldiers clashed on distant fields, the truest struggle has always been internal, a war of the mind, conscience, and heart. In every age, the country faces the same profound choice. Will we choose comfort or courage, fear or freedom? From the earliest settlers who wrestled with survival in a harsh wilderness, to patriots who defied a global empire, to modern citizens, confronting social injustice and political division, the battle for the soul of freedom has been relentless, demanding, and deeply personal. The Revolutionary War was the nation's first crucible. Ordinary men and women, farmers and merchants, students and artisans stood against the might of Britain. They had no navy to rival the royal fleet, no treasury to fund armies, no guarantee of survival, only conviction. Every choice carried immense risk. To join a militia meant leaving one's family vulnerable. To dissent meant imprisonment or death. To speak for independence was treason in the eyes of the crown. Yet, despite fear, they acted. The Declaration of Independence was more than ink on parchment. It was a proclamation written in courage, defiance, and hope. Every skirmish, every winter at Valley Forge, every secret meeting demonstrated that freedom was not a gift, but a pursuit, one that demanded bravery in the face of uncertainty. But even as independence was won, the young nation faced internal contradictions that tested its moral courage. Slavery persisted, women were denied political voice, and indigenous populations were pushed aside. Freedom existed as a principle, but was denied to millions. Americans were forced to confront the stark reality that liberty without justice is incomplete. The courage required to acknowledge these contradictions was profound. A battle not of muskets but of conscience. Activists, writers, and ordinary citizens questioned laws and norms, fought for abolition, and advocated for women's rights. Understanding that true freedom demanded vigilance and moral clarity, the Civil War represents the ultimate internal struggle. Brother fought against brother, state against state, as the nation teetered on the edge of dissolution. Over 600,000 lives were lost in a conflict that asked a fundamental question. Could a nation founded on liberty survive its own contradictions? Soldiers faced not only the brutality of battle, but the ethical weight of the cause itself. Every engagement from Antietam to Gettysburg tested courage, conviction, and endurance. And while the Union was preserved, the wounds of slavery and division endured. The moral courage displayed by abolitionists, soldiers, and civilians alike ensured that the fight for freedom was not only won on battlefields but in the hearts and laws of the nation. In the decades following the Civil War, freedom remained a work in progress. African Americans, though legally free, faced segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence. Leaders such as Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, and W.E.B. Du Bois dedicated their lives to confronting systemic injustice, often at great personal risk. They published newspapers, gave speeches, organized communities, and lobbied politicians, showing that bravery is multifaceted. It is intellectual, moral, and often quietly persistent. Every action they took demanded courage, courage to speak, truth to power, courage to defy societal norms, and courage to imagine a society where equality was real, not aspirational. The struggle for women's rights also illuminated the moral battles within the nation. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and countless other suffragists challenged a society that denied half the population a political voice. They marched, petitioned, and endured ridicule, imprisonment, and public hostility, demonstrating that courage often takes the form of persistent advocacy. Their victories, most notably the ratification of the 19th Amendment, were not given freely, but earned through decades of tireless struggle. Every ballot cast by women thereafter was a testament to their bravery and to the ongoing choice of courage over comfort. The 20th century brought new forms of internal struggle. The civil rights movement demanded moral courage on a massive scale. Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her bus seat, the courage of students who sat at segregated lunch counters, the marches across bridges and through streets. Each act challenged entrenched systems of fear, oppression, and inequality. These individuals faced fire hoses, dogs, jail cells, and assassination attempts, yet their courage was unwavering. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, and countless unnamed citizens demonstrated that bravery is often a collective force, built through persistence, solidarity, and moral conviction. Bravery is not only expressed in overt protest or civil disobedience. It exists in quieter arenas, in the ballot box, in classrooms, in workplaces, in community organizing. Democracy is fragile and freedom demands vigilance. Each citizen who participates, who questions, who challenges injustice, becomes a soldier in the ongoing battle for liberty. Acts of moral courage, voting despite intimidation, teaching history honestly, confronting discrimination, sustain the nation in ways that battles alone cannot. The fight for freedom is as much about conscience as it is about strategy. It is fought daily in countless small acts that cumulatively define the character of the nation. Wars abroad have tested American bravery, but they are inseparable from internal moral choices. Soldiers who risk life and limb in foreign fields confront fear and mortality, but also face the question of why they fight. Immigrants, minorities, and women who joined the war effort on the home front navigated suspicion and prejudice while sustaining the nation's survival. Their courage was manifested not only in action but in persistence, in contribution, and in resistance to societal expectations. Liberty, in these instances, demanded that individuals act boldly, whether in uniform, in factories, or in volunteer service. The Cold War and modern political struggles brought yet another dimension of the internal battle. Fear of ideology, persecution, and surveillance tested the courage of citizens who dared to speak out, dissent, or advocate for reform. Bravery became a defensive principle, an assertion that conscience cannot be silenced by intimidation or threat. Whistleblowers, journalists, and activists exemplified the ongoing challenge. Freedom requires repeated choices, repeated acts of moral courage, and repeated resistance to the easy path of comfort or silence. Education and civic engagement are central weapons in the ongoing battle for freedom. Schools, libraries, and community organizations empower citizens to recognize injustice, analyze problems, and advocate for solutions. Knowledge is courage, the courage to question, to speak, and to act. Those who educate, teach, and mentor become defenders of liberty, shaping the moral and civic framework of future generations. Every lesson in history, every classroom discussion about equality or rights, is a microcosm of the larger battle for the soul of the nation. The modern era presents challenges that are less visible but equally vital. Systemic inequality, political polarization, threats to democratic institutions, and social injustice demand vigilance and action. Courage is required to confront apathy, resist corruption, and advocate for marginalized communities. The choices made by ordinary citizens, whether to volunteer, to vote, to protest, or to educate, are as critical to the survival of freedom as any battlefield heroism. Bravery today is measured in persistence, integrity, and moral clarity. The battle for freedom also requires confronting history honestly. Recognizing past injustices, slavery, segregation, exclusion, and oppression, is not an act of shame, but of moral courage. Learning from mistakes allows the nation to chart a more just path forward. Citizens who acknowledge wrongs, advocate for reform, and resist repetition of past errors are actively engaged in defending the soul of freedom. Courage is required not only to fight for justice, but to admit where it has been denied and to act decisively to correct it. The ongoing struggle is deeply personal as well as collective. Each citizen faces the choice between fear and action, conformity and conscience, comfort and courage. Ordinary acts, standing up to injustice in a workplace, challenging prejudice in conversation, teaching children to question and act, accumulate into a national ethos. Freedom is preserved in these small, persistent acts of moral courage, demonstrating that bravery is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. From the Revolution to the Civil War, from women's suffrage to civil rights, from labor movements to modern activism, one lesson persists: freedom is not automatic and bravery is not innate. Each generation must choose it anew. Every protest, every vote, every speech, every act of conscience contributes to the living tapestry of liberty. The nation is only as brave as its people. Ultimately, the battle for the soul of freedom is ongoing. It is fought in streets, classrooms, offices, and homes. It is waged in ballots cast, laws written, and communities nurtured. It is carried by ordinary citizens whose names may never appear in history books, yet whose courage sustains the moral backbone of the nation. Freedom is a responsibility, not a gift, and bravery is the glue that holds it together. A nation is not born brave. It becomes brave only when its citizens repeatedly choose courage over comfort, principle over expedience, and action over passivity. Every generation inherits this mantle, and with it the question persists: Will we choose fear or will we choose bravery? Will we defend liberty not only in moments of grand drama, but in the everyday acts of conscience and courage that define the nation's character? History is watching, the world is watching, and the answer lies within each of us. The soul of freedom endures only because individuals, again and again, choose to act, to speak, and to insist that liberty is inseparable from justice. This is the unbroken thread that binds the past to the present, ordinary citizens to monumental heroes, and ideals to reality. America remains the land of the brave when courage is chosen, nurtured and embodied in every age, in every act, and in every heart willing to defend it.